Hello, and welcome to a very spooky Rant Rave review. It is Halloween, the day of candy corn and pumpkins and spooky skeletons and ghosts. And today I thought I would talk a little bit about H.P. Lovecraft, the stories that I love from him, some of his controversial aspects, and then, bonus, a game based on Lovecraft. So, it's really a rant rave review about Lovecraft and Sinking City at the end. Sinking City is the game, but we'll do Lovecraft first because you gotta. So, you either know everything about Lovecraft or you know nothing about Lovecraft, but long story short, 1920s circa American dude. He writes about eldritch horror or Lovecraftian horror or the Cthulhu mythos. All of those things, Lovecraft. It's almost like a genre. It really is a genre of fantasy that he and the Lovecraft circle kind of, I would say, popularized, not necessarily invented. I've actually been listening to this amazing channel called Horror Babble on YouTube. I will link to it below, which has introduced me to a number of other horror writers from the same time period. Lovecraft himself was inspired by this story called stories, kind of like a fix-up novel called The King in Yellow, which is about this cursed play called The King in Yellow, where if you read it, you go insane, like you do. Which he then invented the Necronomicon, which is a book where if you read it, you go insane, like you do. And it's interesting because Lovecraft and several other of his friends and other writers were all kind of writing their stories usually either set on Earth or in a fantasy world or like an ancient time on Earth, and they have this like pantheon of like eldritch or elder gods, and a bunch of them actually are secretly the same. So like I've heard, I don't know this for sure, but I've heard that the snake cult in Conan, like those books, are worshipping one of the gods that's actually from like the Cthulhu mythos. So it's neat. It's this neat little genre of horror. And if you on my blog go back and read like a bajillion, 5 million years ago, I wrote this where does the horror come from? And I kind of did this whole shtick about different horror movies and such. The horror in Lovecraft sometimes it comes from like going insane. But it also comes from the idea of like you're this little human going about your life. Maybe you're an archaeologist or a journalist or a detective or whatever, living in New England. Most of his stories are set in New England or whatever. And, you know, you view the world a certain way and then you discover something. Maybe it's an artifact or an ancient city or a book. And it turns your world upside down because you realize that there are these like eldritch gods or things with a capital T that we don't understand and you can't possibly conceive of with your small human mind. And the great thing is like that's the reality. Like that's real. There's just things out there that we don't understand and it makes you go crazy trying to think about them. Someone described it where like it would be like if you were an ant, like kind of like if you were an ant being picked up by a human and you have no idea, like you don't know what a human is, you just see like pink flesh like this and it's like huge and you can't even conceive of it. And yeah, so that's where the horror comes from, mostly, sometimes. But he also had a lot of like little horror stories, which I rather like. Full confession, I find the Cthulhu like story to be the most boring. I'm like Cthulhu. I'm a Neural-Hotep kind of girl myself. Yeah, no. Yeah, I just don't find Cthulhu that scary or interesting. But I will go over a few of my favorite Lovecraft stories. Like, yeah. So, and I try not to give things away. It's funny, because, like, I do think that, like, it is spoilery, because I hadn't read any Lovecraft. Like, I've heard a million things about him, but I feel like you really should, like, read them yourself for the spookiness and the scariness and the ambiance. Like, it's interesting. His stories are a real slow burn. Like, Mountains of Madness and Rats in the Walls. So those are two. Mountains of Madness, Rats in the Walls. They're, like, 90% of the story is literally, like, we found some stuff. It's a really old city. Here's all the stuff we can tell about from the old city. Like, nothing actually happens in, like, most of those stories. And in the ending, you're like, oh, like, Rats on the Walls has a crazy ending. And, yeah. But those are really good. It's a slow burn, and it's a kind of a, like, you're looking at the evidence of something horrible having happened. Or something terrifyingly, like, ancient having happened. And it's really cool. So those are two really good stories. I rather like The Festival, which is just a very straight up, normal horror story where there's this guy who supposedly has this, like, really important ancestry and this, like, secret cult, and he goes to this place in England during the festival, and he's like, oh, like, for all of, like, the plebeians, it's Christmas, but for us, and no, it's, like, this ancient festival that predates, like, the pilgrims, and he goes into this house, and you know, he sees this person, and there's already some, like, weirdness going on of, like, how many people are in the house, or did this person leave? Like, strange things happening, and then all these people start coming out of, like, into the streets, and he's, like, walking, and he, like, shoves into one of them, and it, like, feels, like, pulpy, and I'm just like, oh, and, like, the more and more, cats are having fun, the more and more it goes, the more and more, like, you know, creepy it is. So The Festival, I won't go into it, but it's really good. The Thing on the Doorstep, a classic. That is one that could be truncated, like, it's a little too long, but let me just say, like, the premise is basically there's this guy who knows this, the narrator's friend basically falls in love with this, like, she's essentially the daughter of, like, a witch, like, for all intents and purposes, this, like, magician who does some dark deeds and likes to kind of, like, either mesmerize people or, like, body switch, like, body swap. And so you think when you hear the thing on the doorstep, and, like, there's all these certain details, and I'm like, I know what that's gonna be. But the ending is, like, so much worse than what you're like, yeah, like, that one's great because it, like, it lulls you into a false sense of security. So whatever you think the thing on the doorstep is gonna be, it's way worse. So read The Thing on the Doorstep. It's worth it. The ending is worth it. Similarly, the Dunwich Horror. The Dunwich Horror is excellent. It's a bit long, but I think it's all really rather interesting. Again, weird New England town, weird family doing weird rites, R-I-T-E-S. And yeah, that one has a nice slow burn, and the last sentence of that little story is, like, kind of more of a long short story. The last sentence of the Dunwich Horror is, like, it's really good. So highly recommend those. Yeah, I don't know. I just really like Lovecraft in general. I don't think some of his stories are kind of meh, but those ones are, like, they're, like, the best for the, you know, like, those are the ones that everyone recommends, like, because they're great. I personally like The Haunter in the Darkness, which I believe is the last story he wrote. And here is we're going to talk about the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is Lovecraft's racism, because he was a racist. His black cat was named think of the most unfortunate thing you could name a black cat. That was what his cat was named. And that is what the cat in The Rats on the Walls is also named. Fun fact. Yeah, so he was, definitely, and, if you've read Shadow over Innsmouth, it's about, like, this, like, people who, like, in order to get, like, they're a fishing village, and in order to get, you know, good fishing waters and prosperity, they make this, like, pact with these, like, underwater fish people, but part of the pact is they have to, like, mate with them, and they make this, like, race of, like, horrible half fish, half human, which is great for a horror story. Unfortunately, it was, like, all about, like, miscegenation, and how you shouldn't marry, like, non-white people, and you're like, yeah. So that's the thing about Lovecraft, is he's a bit problematic. Like, if by a bit, I mean, like, whoop, yeah. But here's what I think is fascinating. Like, the muses take over. So, like, you have this dude who is a racist, and yet, like, in The Haunter in the Dark, for example, it's basically about, like, there's this church with this, like, hideous eldritch thing in it, that can only come out at night, or in the dark, in darkness. And all the little, like, superstitious, quote-unquote, Italian immigrants who live around the church are like, don't go in there. It's bad. It's super bad. And this, of course, this, you know, guy meddles in it, and he finds a skeleton of this journalist who was also meddling in it, and he basically awakens this thing, the Haunter in the Dark. It might be Nyarlathotep, I forget. Anyway, and this thing, you know, obviously is trying to get out and attack people, and it can't really go too far because all the electric lighting, because it's the 1920s, so there's electric lights. And then one day there's this storm that's gonna, like, you know, it's threatening to zap out the electricity, so all the, like, superstitious, quote-unquote, ignorant, quote-unquote, Italian immigrants, like, surround the church and have, like, candles and flashlights and, like, umbrellas to try and, like, and they're basically, like, keeping it at bay because they know exactly what's going on. And they're, like, and it's, like, presented as, like, I don't know, like, they're, like heroic. And I was like, this is, like, fascinating. I'm like, do you know what you're doing? Like, this is intentional, right? And then there's other things where, like, I don't think it was intentional, but I think it's extremely ironic and fascinating. Like, oh my gosh, mini rant. So this is mostly a rave. Mini rant. Lovecraft Country failed hard. I have never seen the show. Maybe the show is brilliant. I read the first chapter of the book, and then I read the Wikipedia of the rest because it was so boring. Lovecraft Country, in theory, is supposed to be like a riff on Lovecraft's racism. Except that it's like not really Lovecraftian. Like there's kind of a cult and like kind of like this like lineage, like kind of. But there's not really like this like eldritch god type thing. And I'm like, if you want to be Lovecraftian, you gotta have like eldritch gods. It's kind of what you do. Like the first story kind of involves that, and like one of the others does, but the rest are just like average horror stories, and I'm like, that's not scary. Oh, did I mention that they're not scary? 3, it treats you like an idiot. Like there was one part where, because it's about racism, right? Like the main character's black, and he goes to this, like, probably like people who like used to own his like ancestors, and they're like a cult, and they need him for like a blood ritual or whatever. And like there's a part where like it's talking about how like, you know, oh, like we let the hounds out to like track down vermin, and you're like, like what these racist people are saying is actually they use hounds to track down black people. And then later in the story, there's a character who's like, we track down vermin. Like as it like to like underline, it's like, yeah, no, we got that, author. Like we're not idiots. Like, do you think we're idiots? Like we understood that was obviously what you were talking about. You don't have to like underline it for us. Like it just treated you like an idiot. It was very like paint by numbers, like racism's bad, and it's like, no way, really. And then the worst part, maybe this is just the narrator. But the audiobook, so they're in New England, right? New England, and they get pulled over by racist cops because, of course, all cops are racist according to, like, this writer, who's white, incidentally, fun fact. And the 2 cops in New England, rural New England, that pull them over have, like, southern accents, and I was like, that's not, like, classist and racist, and I don't even know all this, but, like, I'm gonna give the author the benefit of the doubt and assume that the narrator was the racist one, or racist, I don't even know. What is it called when you randomly, like, think that all, like, white people who are racist are Southern? I'm like, it's anti-Southern. I don't know what it's awful. It's just awful. I was like, this is so offensive, like, to my brain cells and to Southerners. Like, yeah, it's just not a good book. But the reason it's not a good book, aside from the fact that it's not scary and it's not Lovecraftian and it's boneheaded, is the fact that, like, Lovecraft, like, lovingly wrapped a gift for you in the form of rats in the walls. Let's go back to Rats in the Walls. I'll spoil should I spoil? I'm gonna spoil it. I don't want to spoil all of it. I'll spoil some of it, okay? Not the very ending. But Rats in the Walls is basically, there's this guy who, his family's from England. They were a very old family, very aristocratic, but they were kind of like Elizabeth Bathory type, like, rumors. There was rumors about them being, like, bad and doing bad things. And then one of their, like, sons basically, like, burned down the whole estate and murdered the family and then moved to America. And then, like, the family, like, you know, whatever. And so the main character, the narrator, it's after the war. His son has died in the war. He and his son's, like, colonel or friend or whoever, like, go back to the old estate in England to try and fix it up. And he, like, in the narration is like, it can't be that bad, like, whatever my family did. Like, the worst thing my family did is, like, such and such an uncle, like, went and, like, married a black lady and became a voodoo priest. Like, and you're like, okay, that's, like, typical, like, Lovecraftian racism. Okay. Okay. Throughout the course of the story, they find out that what really happened is, like, they dig through this vault, and in the, like, there's, like, the basement of the castle, and then under the basement of the castle is this huge cave with, like, underground pastures and underground holding cells slash, like, stables? And there's, like, skeletons all over the place. Some of them have, like, teeth marks, human teeth marks on them. And there's a butcher shop, and you're like, oh. And it's like, he keeps having these dreams of, like, strange, fleshy-looking cattle, and you're like, oh no. And they find all these skeletons that are more like quadrupedal. And it turns out that his family were, like, raising human cattle and cannibalizing them, and probably also, like, stealing people from the villages to, like, eat, and that's why, like, everyone hated them, and that's why when their one son, like, found out what was going on, he, like, burned everything to the ground and, like, fled. Okay? And it's great, because the whole, like, it's such a, like, again, I'm like, Lovecraft, like, is this just the muses? Like, I don't know. Because, okay, so you have, like, this story, and I'm like, is it unintentional irony, or is it, like, is he actually smart? Where you have the main character who's like, like, our most, like, horrible thing is that some guy, like, married, like, a black lady. How terrible. Mixed races is terrible. Unlike my pure bloodline of white people who are raising human cattle and are cannibals. Like, and I'm like, that's ironic, right? Was it intentional? Like, I don't know, but it's brilliant. And I'm like, getting back to my rant, dear guy who wrote Lovecraft Country, H.P. Lovecraft himself, like, lovingly, like, gave you this gift with a bow on it and was like, here, use this. Use white people who are raising human cattle and are the real monsters. Use that. No? Okay. You don't have to use that. There's another story. I think it's called The Signal Man, where there's, like, a guy who's creepy and he's a monster, and at the end it's revealed he has, like, a white tentacle for a face. Like, you could use that with the KKK. The cover artist of Lovecraft Country did, but the actual author was, like, too... I'm like, did he not read Lovecraft? Like, Lovecraft gave you this. You could use this. Like, white tentacle face. Monsters. No? All these characters in so many Lovecraft countries who are super proud of their bloodline, but it turns out that their bloodline is, like, creepy cultists doing weird things. And yes, sometimes it's like, oh, they, like, married a different, like, race. But oftentimes it's like, no, they were just cannibals. Like, their pure white race was just cannibals. Like, and I'm like, I want someone who's smarter to rewrite Lovecraft Country to, like, actually incorporate Lovecraft and the themes that he had. Which brings me into, fun fact, that somebody smarter was whoever the heck wrote Sinking City. Yeah, okay, so that's my transition. Read Lovecraft, it's great. It's a little problematic, but you know what? Like, oh, I also forgot! Reanimator, Herbert West Reanimator, also excellent. Anyway, side note, no editing in this video, my friends. If I edit it, it will come out like 8 months from now. I can't do this. Okay. Herbert West Reanimator is what Frankenstein wishes it was, where, like, the evil scientist is the real monster, and then the monsters, like, justifiably turn on him. It's way better. Read it. It's like 5 little mini segments. Excellent. Read it. You won't be disappointed. Okay. Sinking City. What is Sinking City? Sinking City is a video game that no one played, because when it first came out, it was, like, only available on, I want to say, Nintendo, and some fools don't own Nintendo. I just don't even know. Okay, whatever. You should all... Nintendo's the best. Nintendo, Capcom, like, Heart, that's... Yeah, whatever. Anyway, my sister owns, like, every game system known to man. So, she bought it when it came out. And it is... Before it came out, my brother showed me the trailer. And it's basically, like, this, like, really soggy. The trailer is like there's a soggy city, and there's this guy who's like having like visions of like himself coming to shoot him, or he's drowning, and there's this like tentacle Lovecraftian monster, and he's like going crazy, and you're like, what's that? Sinking City. The premise is it's like 1920s Lovecraftian horror, and you play a detective. And I'm like, that's everything I could want in the world. Yeah, it's great. And so my sister bought it, and again, I am a weenie who can't play horror games or anything involving shooting other than Portal. So I just sat and watched her play the whole thing, and it was great. Okay, so like I said, 1920s. Basically, like you arrive. The like backstory is you were in the war. You were in a diving team, and you dived and like encountered something under the waves, something, and you are all messed up. You get these weird headaches and these visions. And so to try and figure out your condition, you are trying to find this doctor who's in this island. I think it's called Oakmont is the setting. It's your typical, like, New England island that is a Lovecraft setting. And you go there, and basically, right away you happen upon a murder, and you have to solve it. It's this rich guy's son. And you basically, like, have to be a detective and solve crimes. And why do you have to be a detective? Because this city does not use money. This city uses bullets and scrap metal. Because in the near past, we're not exactly sure. And it's great because, like, they never show you the exact year, and they never say exactly when things happen. The city got flooded. So it's literally like a sinking city. Some of the streets are completely flooded. You have to take a boat. There's like beached whales. There's mold everywhere. My sister and I were joking, and we're like, what if the twist is that, like, nobody, like, there isn't any eldritch things? Everyone's just gone crazy from, like, black mold. Anyway, yeah, there's, like, dead fish, and part of the, like, the higher up, fancier part of the city isn't as flooded, so it's really fascinating. It's just a great creepy setting, and you have to make your way, and it's basically like after the flood. The way they date things in the city is they do before the flood, during the flood, and after the flood. And right now it's kind of like semi-post-apocalyptic, like, you know, they're still fancy and stuff, and they still have 1920s, like, outfits and tech, but, like, they're kind of, like, let's just say that, it kind of seems like people are unable to leave the island. That's not actually necessarily true, but, like, it's kind of like, So anyway, you have to use bullets and stuff instead of money. You have to work for all these different people, all these different families, all these different cults. Yeah, so... And, okay, so that's, like, part one of the game. And I'm like, okay, that's pretty cool. All of that is, like, check all my boxes. Great. Now, as a game mechanic, how do you solve crimes? Well, some of it is, like, you know, you get letters and you have to look at your map and figure out where things happen. You can look for clues. There's a newspaper office you can check, the police records you can check, hospital and insane asylum records you can check. You can talk to different people. But also, because of your weird headaches and whatever the heck you saw down in the ocean, you are a little bit psychic, which is like, check that box for me! I'm like, psychic in the 1920s? Detective? Yeah, so as a game mechanic, it's psychometry. So basically, you'll go into a building, and you can, like, touch things, or you'll see either, like, little, like, kind of ghosty looking, ravens if it has to do with death, or like weird jellyfish if it has to do with like eldritch things. And if you can either follow them or follow like ghostly looking figures to different clues. Sometimes you'll see these little like bright wiggly spots, wiggly woos. Oh my gosh, my sister and I came up with this whole like language for describing. It wasn't as scary, but wiggly woos. Anyway, yeah, but if you touch it, it'll like show you a scene from the past. Or once you get enough clues, it'll like go whoosh, and the whole area will turn blue, and you'll see little, almost like dioramas of people, and if you touch them, like, you'll hear, like, dialogue of what happened, and you'll see, like, little flashes of what happened, so you have to put together, like, here's the order that these events happened in. And you also have a little, like, mind palace where your clues will show up, and you can make different conclusions, and the different conclusions that you'll create will, like, tell you who you should help. Because usually, often, in all the major cases, like there's like side cases you can do, but the major cases are like, usually it's like two opposing factions. Like, who do you help? Like, do you help the like cult that's trying to like poison the like city in order to like do such and such, or are you trying to help like this like faction that's like totally violent and murder somebody? Like, it's very interesting. Often there's not a good choice, often there is a good choice. Like, there's one choice where you can frame a guy for murder, and it's totally the accurate moral choice. He was gonna murder somebody else. He was gonna murder his own mother. But no, you can frame a guy for murder in this game. Like, check. Like, yeah, this game is so good. Yeah, so that's like the best part of the game. And then, of course, like, the part I haven't mentioned yet is the horror. It's a horror game, duh. And here's what I find fascinating about this game. The horror mostly doesn't come from the monsters. There's only like 4 basic types of monsters plus a couple bosses, and then a few like different iterations of those 4 types of monsters, which again, my sister and I gave them amazing names like Candy Boys, Friends. The friends are made of multiple friends. Dead friends. Doggos, which are the annoying dog enemy that you gotta have, and Spitty Boys are horrifying, like, X-people. A lot of X-people. Yeah. Well, anyway, there's a whole side case where you find out, like, what created these monsters. But the monsters aren't that scary. But the situations are. And it was just, and again, like, so, like, the monsters, it's like a, I don't know, it's a testament to how interesting these situations are, that the game itself is actually rather basic, and yet it's still fun. So the monsters, again, only 4. The building layouts, literally, like, they will just reuse building layouts. There's basically like a factory, a house with a boat in it, like a factory with an underground, a rich house, and like, I think like one other type of building. Like maybe like 6 layouts ever. There might be walls put in between. Like an apartment also, like a multiple apartment building. And you know, they'll add walls so it's a little bit different, but you can kind of like, once you've been around the city enough, you're like, yeah, I know the layout of all these buildings. But A, like, you don't know where all the monsters are, and B, like, the situations in them are different. Like, there's one house, there's a side case where you find all these letters from this person who's had all these horrible visions, and they tell you to go to different places in the city and just investigate. And usually you find something cool in each little place, something cool or creepy. And in one of them, it's talking about this guy, like, built this church, and then, like, he went crazy. I forget what happened. He saw something when he was building the church, and he, like, hung himself. And you're like, okay, so you have to go to that house, and you open the door, and, like, there's a dead body hanging, and you're like, I'm just gonna close the door. But you have to investigate. Like, you're like, okay, I have to investigate. So you open the door, and you go in, and you're like... And it's great, too, because in this game, it's one of those games that have an insanity meter. And sometimes when you see scary things like monsters or dead bodies, your insanity meter rises, and you're like, yikes. So you're like looking at the dead body, and you're like, okay. So you turn the corner, and there's like 3 more like people like hanging, and you're like, why? It's one of those games where it just makes you feel so uncomfortable, and it's so cool. The scariest place in the entire game is there's one building on that quest of like weird visions where there are no monsters. There's no monsters in the entire building. And that like creates this false sense of security because you're like, something's gonna jab out, and it never does. But then you like go throughout the building and you see like all this like certain blood stains and certain evidence, and you're like, what happened here? Oh, whatever happened here, it's out in the city now. And like, nothing comes of it. It's not important to the plot or to anything, but like, just that like, like piecing together like what happened and what will happen, you're just like, oh no. It's like reading a really good horror story. So yeah. Again, like, the monsters aren't that interesting. The layouts are like meh. The ending was almost kind of like meh, because it's really hard to end a Lovecraftian, like, thing satisfyingly without you just going crazy. And boy, oh boy, you can go crazy if your, like, insanity meter goes all the way. Oh boy, surprising things happen. I'll just let y'all play the game and find out what happens. Nothing too major, but, like, my sister and I were quite shocked because we never let it go until a certain point, and we were like, holy cow, that's what happens. But no, it's just a super fun game. It's super interesting. If you like detective-y stuff, if you like horror games, if you like Lovecraft, it it's just a really fun, like, exploration of that world. And there's a bunch of homages and references to Lovecraft things. I'd read, like, a bunch of Lovecraft before playing. I was like, I recognize that. And then I read more, and I was like, oh, holy cow, it's, like, chocked full of references to Lovecraft stuff. And, yeah, it's just creepy. And, like, again, like, that nice sense of, like, I don't know, like you kind of have to read into some of it, and yeah, I don't know, it's spooky, it's great. If you it's available on a lot of more game systems now than it was before. I highly recommend Sinking City. Buy it, play it, do all the side cases, buy all the DLCs. You get to wear cool outfits. That's what you get for, like, doing the side cases, is cool outfits. Frame a man for murder if you want to. It's okay. He was a terrible person anyway. Yeah, and that's all I have for this Halloween. I'm glad that I got to film something on time, and I hope you all have a very spooky holiday, and I will see you next time. Bye!